If you imagine knights as noble heroes riding off toward the sunset with their beloved maidens, it's time for a reality check. The version of the medieval knight from the movies is as factual as a documentary about fairy tales. Genuine knights weren't chivalrous saviors. They were effectively armored mercenaries in costly metal, inhabiting a world so savage that a modern person likely wouldn't survive a single day. The truth is, almost everything you believe about knighthood is a misconception. The honor, the glory, the romance. It was all meticulously constructed propaganda. The reality was defined by squalor, sickness, violence, and a social structure engineered to crush both the body and the soul. Curious just how grim it was? Let's shatter some popular myths. Utterly broke. Here is your initial dose of truth. The majority of knights were destitute. Not just struggling with the bills, destitute, but selling the family silver to buy horse feed, destitute. The medieval economy was structured to work against knights. While they received land grants, there was a major string attached. That land came with immense responsibilities. Knights were obligated to perform military service, afford pricey gear, maintain their households, and finance their own military campaigns. It was akin to having a job where you had to pay your boss. A single set of plate armor was worth more than a peasant's earnings over 15 years. A quality warhorse. That's another decade of a peasant's wages. Factor in weapons, upkeep, training, and staff, and you're dealing with costs that make modern luxury car financing seem trivial. Many knights took on debt simply to meet their feudal obligations. They would put their lands up as collateral, pawn their ancestral weapons, and some even married off their daughters to secure funds for their knightly duties. The financial strain was so severe that entire aristocratic lineages vanished, simply because they could no longer afford the knightly lifestyle. The truly affluent lords weren't the ones on the battlefield. They were the ones providing loans to desperate knights at exorbitant interest rates. This was medieval capitalism at its most savage, wrapped in a veneer of honor and duty. And if a knight was wounded and unable to fight, it was game over. No disability pay, no retirement plan, no safety net at all. Just poverty and disgrace until death offered the final release from his debts. The romanticized vision of the affluent, mighty knight is largely modeled on the top 1%, the dukes and earls who could actually support the lifestyle. Everyone else was merely one poor harvest or a single lost battle away from absolute ruin. This isn't what they teach you in standard history lessons. The sanitary situation. Now, let's discuss something Hollywood conveniently ignores. How knights managed basic bodily functions while encased in 60 pounds of steel. Relieving oneself in full armor was a logistical ordeal that demanded planning, help, and a total surrender of one's dignity. Knights couldn't simply use a latrine. They required at least 2 assistants to help them remove sections of armor, a process that took roughly 20 minutes. During a long campaign or a siege, this turned into a massive problem. So, what was their solution? Many knights just relieved themselves inside their armor. Yes, you read that correctly. They would urinate and defecate within their metal suits during extended battles or sieges. The armor itself had to be built with this harsh reality in mind. Some suits had rudimentary drainage holes and removable padding for later cleaning. Castle latrines were public events, typically constructed over moats or rivers. There was no privacy, no toilet paper, just communal wooden benches where knights sat next to each other, handling their business while chatting about politics or strategy. The stench was so potent that many castles featured separate toilet towers for summer and winter to try and control the odor. Personal hygiene was just as appalling. Knights might bathe 3 or 4 times per year, under the belief that excessive washing weakened the body and left them susceptible to illness. They would wear the same set of underclothes for months on end, creating a perfect habitat for lice, fleas, and infections that were as deadly as any plague. Their answer to body odor was to use heavy perfumes and spices, which only concealed the smell and created a nauseating blend of aromas. Picture sitting beside someone who hasn't washed in months but has drenched themselves in medieval-era cologne. That was your average night. And here's the most unsettling detail. They considered this completely normal. A clean person was seen as weak, vain, and potentially heretical. Being filthy was perceived as a mark of military virtue and religious piety. Cooked alive, medieval armor wasn't merely cumbersome. It was a death trap that essentially turned knights into mobile furnaces. Full-plate armor could reach internal temperatures exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit, or 49 degrees Celsius, on a typical day. In direct sunlight or during summer campaigns, knights frequently died from heat stroke before even encountering an enemy. Their own protective gear was killing them more effectively than opposing forces. The metal absorbed and held heat so well that knights would literally bake inside their suits. Perspiration became lethal, as there was no way for the moisture to evaporate. It just collected inside the armor, forming a humid inferno that made it difficult to breathe. Many knights asphyxiated in their own sweat. During the Crusades, European knights in the Middle Eastern heat dropped like flies. Entire battalions would collapse, not from arrows or swords, but from hyperthermia. The very metal armor that shielded them in Europe's cooler weather became an instrument of agony in the desert. Knights devised frantic cooling tactics that sound like medieval torture. They had servants pour cold water into the gaps of their armor, but this provided only brief relief and actually caused the metal to conduct heat more efficiently. Some attempted to wear ice-soaked rags underneath, but this led to frostbite in the winter and melted instantly in the summer. The savviest knights learned to fight in the early morning or late evening, but medieval combat rarely adhered to a convenient schedule. Battles were fought when they occurred, and knights had to weigh protection against survival. Here's the truly crazy part. They were aware the armor was killing them, but removing it meant a guaranteed death from enemy weapons. So, they chose a slow roasting over a quick stabbing, betting they could win the fight before their own gear defeated them. Many knights suffered from permanent heat-related health issues, kidney failure, heart problems, and neurological disorders from repeated overheating. The fortunate ones simply fainted and missed the battle. The ultimate knight fighting championship. Medieval tournaments were not sporting competitions. They were sanctioned murder masquerading as popular entertainment. What we refer to as tournaments were originally known as melees, pronounced melees, which were essentially organized battles with an audience. Knights would convene for massive, chaotic brawls where the only guideline was to try not to kill too many combatants. Emphasis on try. The mortality rate at these events was shocking. A single tournament could result in the deaths of dozens of knights and leave hundreds more injured. The notorious tournament at Chauvency, pronounced Chauvency, in 1285 saw over 60 knights killed in one day. Spectators cheered as men were trampled under horses, crushed by fallen foes, or bludgeoned to death with heavy weapons. But here's the truly disturbing aspect. Losing wasn't just about injury or death. Defeated knights were required to forfeit their horses, armor, and weapons to the victor. For a broke knight, this meant complete financial devastation. Many knights literally fought to the death to avoid going bankrupt, pushing past their limits because surrender meant their family would face starvation. The weapons used were not blunted or altered for safety. Knights battled with sharpened swords, real lances, and warhammers crafted to shatter skulls through helmets. Even blunt weapons were fully capable of breaking bones and crushing internal organs. Medical attention at tournaments involved little more than monks reciting prayers over mutilated bodies. If you were knocked out, they would simply wait and see if you regained consciousness. If you didn't after a few hours, they began arranging your funeral. The display was so gruesome that even medieval people, accustomed to public executions and religious torture, sometimes found tournaments too much to bear. Chroniclers wrote of audience members vomiting from the gore and women swooning at the sight of knights being literally dismembered. Yet, knights continued to take part because the alternative, admitting you were too afraid to fight, was social suicide. It was better to die in the arena than to live in shame as a coward. The ransom industry. Knights weren't only warriors. They were also professional abductors running a medieval extortion enterprise. Capturing an enemy knight alive was far more lucrative than killing him. Consequently, medieval battlefields transformed into strange hunting grounds where knights attempted to knock each other out instead of delivering a fatal blow. It was like a violent scavenger hunt where the prize could fight back. The ransom system was so intricate it needed its own class of medieval accountants. A knight's ransom was determined by his social standing, land ownership, family riches, and political clout. Some ransoms were valued at more than entire towns. We're talking about medieval scale fortunes that could bankrupt a kingdom. But this is where it gets truly sinister. Knights would intentionally seek out wealthy adversaries, sometimes disregarding military goals to pursue a valuable capture. Battles were won and lost because knights were sidetracked by the prospect of a ransom instead of obeying commands. The psychological torment was deliberate. Captured knights were held in comfortable conditions, well-fed, given books, and allowed to exercise, specifically to maintain their value. But they were always aware that if their families failed to pay, they would either be sold to someone who could, or just executed after years of false hope. Some knights endured decades of captivity. King John II of France was held for 4 years after his capture at the Battle of Poitiers, pronounced Poitiers. His ransom was so immense it nearly ruined France and led to tax hikes that ignited peasant rebellions. The most twisted part is that knights often befriended their captors during long confinements, only to have to return to the battlefield and potentially face the very people who had been their hosts. Medieval warfare was essentially a violent social club where today's foe could be tomorrow's dinner companion. A failed ransom attempt could annihilate an entire lineage. Families would liquidate everything: land, livestock, daughters' dowries, to try and recover their captured kin. Some noble houses died out not from combat, but from ransom-induced debt. The pious warrior paradox. Knights were meant to be devout warriors, yet they spent the majority of their time engaging in acts that would make a demon recoil. The Catholic Church constructed a bizarre mental paradigm where mass slaughter became a sacred obligation. Knights were informed that slaying infidels, heretics, and enemies of the church would secure their place in heaven. Essentially, a medieval pass to avoid hell for professional killers. But here lies the psychological torment. These same knights had to align this brutal violence with Christian principles of love, forgiveness, and turning the other cheek. The mental acrobatics needed to justify slaughtering whole villages while professing to serve the Prince of Peace shattered many minds. During the Crusades, knights would spend their mornings in prayer, asking for God's favor, and their afternoons butchering civilians. They would attend Mass while still covered in blood, take communion with the same hands that had just strangled a prisoner, and then sleep soundly, convinced they were fulfilling God's will. The Church created complex rituals to absolve knights of their sins. Special masses, indulgences, and pilgrimages were all meant to cleanse the psychological stain of war. But these measures often just made knights feel more entitled to commit further violence. Many knights developed what we would now identify as severe PTSD. But medieval society saw these symptoms as either divine retribution or demonic influence. Knights who couldn't cope with the clash between their faith and their actions were often branded as heretics or lunatics. Some knights broke down completely, becoming religious zealots who saw enemies everywhere and viewed every dispute as a holy war. Others lost their faith altogether, turning into jaded killers who manipulated religious rhetoric to excuse their own brutality. The most chilling cases were the knights who sincerely thought they were saints while carrying out atrocities. They would torture captives while reciting prayers, burn down villages while singing hymns, and assault women while claiming to be purifying them of sin. Medieval chronicles are filled with accounts of knights who went mad trying to navigate these contradictions, speaking to imagined angels, experiencing violent religious hallucinations, or just withdrawing from the world to live as hermits. When knights went rogue, chivalry was, in essence, a medieval PR effort to manage armed sociopaths. And it was a colossal failure. When knights could no longer sustain their lifestyle through lawful means, many resorted to what they termed private warfare, which was just a polite name for organized crime. These were not rare occurrences. Entire areas were terrorized by gangs of rogue knights who had shed any semblance of honor. Knights would establish unauthorized toll roads, extorting money from merchants and travelers at knife point. They would seize abandoned castles, converting them into bandit strongholds to launch raids on nearby villages, acting like medieval crime lords. Some even minted their own coins and ran protection rackets that would impress modern mobsters. The most infamous example is Götz von Berlichingen, pronounced Gertz von Berlichingen, a German knight who operated for decades as, essentially, a medieval warlord. He abducted merchants, blackmailed cities, and waged private wars against anyone who challenged him. When the authorities intervened, he would argue he was merely defending his honor, the medieval version of, "It's not personal, it's just business." During the 100 Years' War, unemployed knights formed mercenary bands that changed allegiances based on who offered more money. These free companies might sack French villages in the morning and then attack English supply lines in the afternoon, their only loyalty being to their paycheck. The peasants bore the brunt of the rogue knight's cruelty, as they had no legal recourse. A knight could assault, murder, and rob commoners with almost no fear of punishment. After all, who would challenge a trained killer in full plate armor? Local lords often turned a blind eye to peasant grievances because they relied on the knight's military support. Some territories became so dangerous that even legitimate knights couldn't travel safely. The very institution created to safeguard society had instead spawned armed predators who preyed upon the vulnerable. Medieval records describe entire counties where no merchant would risk travel, and no peasant would work their fields without armed protection. The Church attempted to curb this anarchy through peace of God movements, threatening excommunication for knights who harmed civilians. But desperate men in expensive armor are not swayed by religious threats when they are on the brink of starvation. So, the next time you feel that modern life is challenging, remember that medieval knights existed in a reality where your career could literally boil you alive, where bankruptcy was a death sentence, and where being a holy warrior demanded that you become a professional sociopath. Today's soldiers have the Geneva Conventions, medical treatment, and psychological counseling. Medieval knights had prayers, crude surgery, and the ever-present threat of financial collapse. We complain about achieving work-life balance. They struggled to balance staying alive with staying employed. The romanticized ideal of knighthood is one of history's greatest marketing triumphs, but the reality was a mix of poverty, brutality, and moral paradoxes that ruined both body and spirit. It certainly makes you appreciate modern-day problems, doesn't it? At least your worst day at the office doesn't involve being abducted for ransom or slowly cooking inside your metal underwear. If you want more historical reality checks that will make you thankful for the 21st century, smash that subscribe button, because it seems the past really wasn't the good old days.